Let's kick it off. Welcome everyone to the Scan NATOA 5G deployment training session. Thank you all for attending. We've got a lot to cover today, so we'll get going. My name is Tony Ruggieri. I am the current president of the board of Scan NATOA, and my day job is I'm the city TV production supervisor for the city of Santa Barbara. For those of you that may not be familiar with Scan NATOA and are new to our organization today, Scan NATOA is the states of California and Nevada chapter of the National Association of Telecommunications Officers and Advisors. It's a mouthful, so that's why we go with Scan NATOA. We're a professional organization serving local governments in the development, regulation, and administration of telecommunications systems by offering training, networking, and information on telecommunication and cable TV issues. We do that in a variety of ways. We host educational and training sessions every year on cable and telecommunications issues, like today's session on 5G deployment. And this is the first session on our calendar for this fiscal year. We hold an annual conference, which this year is scheduled for May 26th and 27th, and it will be our 25th annual Scan NATOA Spring Conference. The location is to be determined, and at this stage, we are hoping it will be in person. Stay tuned for more information on the conference soon. We provide networking opportunities with other local government officials and industry representatives. We have up-to-date information on FCC rules and guidelines. Each year we hold the annual STAR Video Programming Awards that recognize the efforts of chapter jurisdictions for providing quality local TV and online media content. We held it last year after being off in 2020. We had our STAR Awards in 2021, and we received 275 entries in the STAR Awards for that year. So we'll do that again, and that corresponds with the timing on our annual conference. We host a website and a listserv that allow you to ask and answer questions and gain insight on regional communications and government access TV issues. And if you are a Scan NATOA member, you get discounts to all of our chapter events. Which brings me to the membership. If you're interested, we want to encourage all of you to join Scan if you are not currently a member, or to renew your membership for this year. And you can do that easily by visiting our website at scannatoa.org and click on the Become a Member link. As I said before, we hold chapter educational and training events. In addition to today's events, this year we're planning a video programming showcase of our Scan NATOA members' award-winning work that will be in January. In February, we'll have a workshop about what is happening with the FCC, the California Public Utilities Commission, wireless issues, and PEG regulations. That'll be another regulatory workshop along the lines of today. In March, we'll have a session on ways to make our government video programming more ADA compliant. And then in April, we have a session plan called Drones, Legal and Operational that we're hoping to be our first in-person session, and that will be held at the Torrance City Cable Studios. And then the year will culminate with our 25th annual Scan NATOA Spring Conference to be held on May 26th and 27th. And keep an eye out for information on that. So again, thank you all for attending today's training session, and I hope we get a chance to meet in person again someday in the not too distant future. Now going to turn it over to Christy Lopez and Jonathan Kramer, two of the Scan board members that are going to talk to you about 5G deployment. Thank you all.
And thank you very much, Tony. I'm Jonathan Kramer, and Christy Lopez is here too, but let me just get us kicked off here. By the way, what you're looking at is a picture of the current Scan NATOA board that was at our retreat a couple of months ago now. I can't even remember. So with that, welcome. And for attorneys, you've seen this phrase many times before, but we're obliged to do it again. An application requesting MCLE credit for this activity is pending for approval by the State Bar of California. Okay. And we've got all of the forms that you're going to need. Now, before we get into this lecture, there are 78 some odd slides, many of them with text, a number of them also without. So don't get crazy about trying to write down everything. The slides are already posted at a website, actually two, that we will show you at the last slide. So stick around for that. So all the information you'll need about getting a copy of these slides, all the information on it, and the MCLA forms is in the last slide. We haven't forgotten about you. We know it's hard to write down everything, especially when you're going, the wireless industry did what? So just hang in there and we'll have some fun. I think most of you know me. I'm the head of Telecom law firm, and we work for way too many local governments in California and way too many local governments actually around the country. Our work is wireless planning, cable administration, gosh, pretty much anything to do with technology is what we do. And I'm the head of it. I founded the firm back in 2006. I am a education wonk, having gone through past my JD to complete my doctorate in law and policy at Northeastern, where I teach part-time. I'm a member of all the usual suspect organizations, and I really have a lot of fun doing all of this stuff. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Christy, who's going to give you all of her background.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm Christy Marie Lopez. I'm a partner at the law firm of Aleshire and Wynder. Our law firm represents many cities throughout the state of California. And as such, I am the assistant city attorney to 3 cities, and I love it. My real joy though is wireless telecommunications. I started studying wireless telecom all the way back in law school, interning at the FCC for the wireless bureau chief, as well as Commissioner Tristani. Moving on to the industry side, I interned for CTIA and then came over here and started doing wireless for local governments, way longer than I'm willing to admit. So, and I've been on the board of NATOA for quite some time, and really enjoy working with the group of NATOA as the board, as well as all of the members. And thank you so much for being here today.
Well, let's move on and start talking about this, Christy.
Yes, so here is our roadmap and where we're going to go. First, why do you care about small cells? We'll be definitely going over all of that. The first image that Jonathan had put up on the title screen gives you an idea of why we should care. And spoiler alert, it only gets worse from there. We're going to go over federal legal parameters. We'll also go over state legal parameters. And then Jonathan is going to take you on a fabulous tour of small cells in throughout the state, or I think it's actually throughout the nation, a varied type of small cells. And you're going to be able to see just how creative you can be and just how bad they can get. We're also going to talk about the OTARD rules, because those have since been amended and do affect how small wireless deployment is going to work out, as well as cable bypass. And then, how do we deal with this all from a local government standpoint? When somebody comes into your city, how do you navigate the process, the permitting process, the approval denial process, conditions of approval, and cost management? All of those will be addressed.
And we say it's sort of a roadmap because we decided to swap slides around in various order, but didn't update this. So it's just to make you figure out where you are in the map here. Forget it, but you'll get there. The next slide is probably one of the most important slides for all of you to understand why you're here and why you should care about small cells. And as a engineer, as a telecommunications engineer, I get invited to speak at wireless industry conferences under the Godfather principle of keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. And at the industry conferences, I hear the numbers typically somewhere between 10 to 60 small cells per square mile per carrier. And right now in California, we've got 3 dominant carriers, and I'm counting Sprint within T-Mobile now because of the merger. And Dish is not deploying yet. They're not deploying small cells. They probably won't for a few years, but they will at some point. So to give you a scope and idea of what you can expect in your community, I decided to pick on Long Beach. I decided to pick on Long Beach because we've got a board member who's from Long Beach and I can get away with this. So I picked Long Beach, and Long Beach has 50.7 square miles of land. So let's do some quick math. And we'll assume that the 3 major carriers are going to deploy small cells there because in fact they already are. But instead of going to 60 or 10, I picked a low number, 20 small wireless facilities. We call them Swiffers, by the way. Can't imagine why. And only half of the land area covered. That still equals about 1,500 new small cells within the next 3 to 5 years. Now, most of them are going to be in the public right-of-way. And the reason is very simple. It's because under settled law, Williams v. Riverside, we don't charge for them to stake stuff in the right-of-way. If they want to put a small cell in the right-of-way, they can do that. If they want to attach to our property, that's a separate issue. And Christy actually will talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. But don't forget that small cells are not specific to the right-of-way. We're already seeing applications for small cells on buildings, frankly, because under the FCC rules, there is a fast path, and in some case, a path past current violations for the carriers to come in and put in small cells that way. So this is an important slide just to frame the entire discussion. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the fact that the small cells will be generally in areas, we hear that from the industry that their goal is to cover areas out to a radius of about 500 feet from the small cell. And you'll see a lot of them grouped together. In fact, you'll see some photographs later in the presentation about small cells that are already being grouped together. But understand this, and this is important as well to frame what's going on in the industry and our world, is that the FCC is currently in the process of revising the OTARD rules to permit fixed wireless to homes. Now, the OTARD is over the air receiving devices, and OTT, by the way, is over the top. And the wireless industry wants to displace cable TV by providing a wireless link into the homes, a fixed wireless link into the homes. Typically, we're expecting to see pretty much flat antennas, square antennas, oddly looking like pizza boxes. That's a reference that'll come up again later, on top of roofs. And the FCC is moving towards a process where that will be outside of our local permitting process. But that's why this is happening as well. It's not just to provide data and to provide voice services to mobile devices. It's also to provide fixed wireless services to things that don't move very often, like homes. Let's move on.
So, you know, as many of us all know who's on this call, in 2018, the FCC passed an order limiting local regulation of small wireless facilities. This order was subsequently challenged, and we'll go over that in a second. But what part of the order remains, and what do we care about? What the FCC did was it defined a small wireless facility. And it's great because all of the rhetoric that we heard about small wireless facilities was these things are very small, they're innocuous, they're the size of a pizza box. Then the FCC came down and told us what the size of a pizza box was. Apparently that's quite large. They can be on a structure that is up to 50 feet in height. It can be, and even with the structure being 50 feet in height, if the surrounding structures are even higher, then the small cell can go up to 10% above the existing infrastructure So if you have, poles that are 60 feet in the right of way or on private property, then you can go up to 66 feet in height for a small cell. It's also whichever is greater. So, we're talking the potential to be very high, and we have seen them very high. And you may have already seen multiple small cells in your jurisdictions that are top mounted on top of some very tall utility poles. And that makes them less than innocuous, but this is what the FCC has told us is a small cell. Now, each antenna is allowed to be up to 3 cubic feet in volume. There is no limit on the number of antennas that they can install for the small cell, but each antenna can be up to 3 cubic feet. So we often see, 3-panel antennas. They are very often less than 3 cubic feet. Now, but that doesn't count the equipment. As we know, the equipment can often be very large. Sometimes it's pole mounted, but oftentimes is ground mounted in an equipment box, which is very noticeable, as we'll see in the next slide. And it's definitely not the size of a pizza box. So unfortunately, the FCC defined the small cells as very large wireless facilities, and now local governments are stuck with dealing with what these terms are. And we've already been seeing the deployment, as I'm sure you've all seen and been processing these. We do have ability to limit certain, objective health and safety requirements, which is under maybe our building code or construction codes. The RF emission safety standards are still required to be complied with. But as you can see, these are some pretty large sites. So, Jonathan, I think you're navigating the PowerPoint. Can you go to the next slide?
I sure can.
Bazinga. And that is 28 cubic feet. As you can see, that is.
I'm sorry. The frame is 28 cubic feet.
Yes. Yeah, so as you can see, that's slightly larger than a pizza box. And so all of the assurances we were given by the industry and by the FCC was translated into something much different than what we were told. And as a result of, this new FCC order, which was not palatable to local governments sued the FCC with an attempt to get everything rectified. Oh, one quick question on the last, or one quick issue on the last side. The correct citation is 47 CFR 1.6000. You'll notice that the section that's listed there, that's supposed to be 47 USC, 1.1312, and now it's 47 USC 1.6000. So that was updated when the FCC amended its rules. So Jonathan, Bazinga, if we go, you'll see that this is about the antennas. Each antenna can be up to 3 cubic feet. It does not count towards the footage that the carriers are allowed to have for the equipment shelters. And like I said, there is no limit to the number of antennas. They can have GPS antennas, there can be microwave dishes, you name it, there's no limit to that. The 6-foot tall panel antennas will likely be within your 3 cubic feet volume. So we do often see, 3 6-foot tall panel antennas installed as small cells, which, will be under the 3 cubic feet per antenna. And then, but if you're looking at antennas that are 8 feet tall, you're probably not going to be within your 3 cubic feet. You're really going to want to look at the carrier spec sheets. The plans that you get provided will have the dimensions listed. Some carriers will do a really great job. On the plans, there'll actually be a calculation of all equipment by cubic feet and a calculation of all of the antennas by cubic feet to demonstrate that they're within the small wireless facility order and that they deserve the protection of the FCC order as well as your code, which hopefully by now you have an ordinance in place to regulate small wireless facilities. So you want to make sure that if those calculations have not been done for you on their plans, that you reach out to the carrier and have those calculations done, and that you double check those calculations to see what exactly you're looking at in size. Because even though it may look like a small wireless facility, because the FCC order allows for such large facilities. Even though it may look like a small wireless facility, it may in fact not be a small wireless facility. So you want to make sure you're double checking those numbers, because if it's not a small wireless facility, the city would have a lot more flexibility in terms of how it's going to process, any approval or denial, as well as additional time to process that approval or denial. So, and we'll talk a little bit about that more. So, and I know Jonathan's going to talk about the shot clocks, but Jonathan, if we go to the next slide, I'll just do a few final thoughts on the FCC's 2018 order. We do have a safe harbor amount under the FCC order. The FCC order has implemented an amount of $270 per pole attachment. And that's what carriers are asking for and demanding. If you want to request more than $270, you do need to do a cost study. And when you do that, you'll probably still get a lot of pushback from carriers, and they'll refute the basis for your cost study. So it does take some work. If you're planning on asking for something more than the safe harbor amount, start now, start early, and be prepared to fight for whatever it is that you want. The great thing was that the FCC order had this regulation that severely limited the city's ability to regulate aesthetics. It said that the city's aesthetic regulations had to be no more burdensome than those applied to other infrastructure developments. It also had to be objective and published in advance. Now, while nobody has a problem with publishing the aesthetic regulations in advance, it also wasn't clear what that meant. Did you have to adopt them? Did you simply, post them to your website? Most cities have chosen to adopt aesthetic regulations by ordinance, but again, this language was unclear. What was great is, thanks to local government, including the city of Portland, the local government agencies, many of them sued the FCC to overturn the 2018 order. What was the cities were successful in doing was to remove this limitation on aesthetic regulations. What the court said was that, aesthetic regulations are inherently subjective and site specific. So there was really no way for cities to implement this portion of the 2018 order, and it was rescinded by the courts. And I can't remember, it was ultimately that the other issues that the court did not weigh in favor of the cities did get, there was a petition to the Supreme Court, but that cert was denied. Also under the FCC order, we got even shorter shot clocks. Small cells are subject to 60 days, but I'm going to let Jonathan talk to you more about that. But I do want to just point out that it is 10 days from the date of submittal that you have to respond. It's 10 days. Everybody, you have 10 days from date of submittal. Jonathan will remind you of that, but I really need to emphasize that because I have almost everyone blowing the deadline.
Christy, I'm sorry, how many days to do the first incomplete?
10 days.
Okay.
Make sure everybody commits that to memory. It is 10 days. The Permit Streamlining Act, which allows you 30 days, does not apply. The FCC has said that does not apply. We have 10 days. So if you hear me say that a couple more times, don't be surprised. And just generally, what the FCC order did was make it much more difficult for a city to be able to deny small wireless facilities within its jurisdiction. As you can tell, this was very much the baby of the industry, and under the FCC's the way the FCC was built in 2018 under that current federal government, the industry had a very friendly FCC. So they were able to get this pushed through with, with quite a bit of success.
I would certainly agree with that. And the one note I'll add to this is regarding the fees that you can charge reasonable fees, basically, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but your fees are not limited to $270 because frankly, most jurisdictions can't even get to the first incomplete for $270. So that's one of the reasons why you need to know what your fees are that's costing you to do these things. If you're going to have outside consultant help, that's included in as well. So it's a number, but it's not the final number. Why don't we move on? And I think this one's mine, isn't it?
It is.
Oh yeah, golly. So there are some new prohibitions in the small cell rules that don't make a whole lot of sense. And this is what the FCC has told us, is that a state or local requirement effectively prohibits deployment. This is the new prohibition when it, quote, materially limits or inhibits any competitors or potential competitors' ability to compete in a fair and balanced legal and regulatory environment. So essentially, all you have to do to comply with this is to anticipate any potential competitor between now and say 1,000 years from now, and make sure that your current rules don't affect that potential or future. Yeah, it's silliness. So you just have to be reasonably fair. Fee requirements, we already talked about this, but just to hit it home, this is the FCC is that have to be reasonably approximate to cost. Well, under California law, we have to do that anyway. No big deal there. Objectively reasonable to pass to applicant. Well, if this is what it's going to cost, it's objectively reasonable, even if Crown Castle, AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, T-Mobile, everybody else says that it's not. And no higher than fees charged to competitors in similar circumstances. Well, this is if you're basing your costs on the actual hourly cost to do it, plus whatever fixed costs you may have, then it's no higher than fees charged to the other competitors because you're charging them the actual cost to process. So you can understand that the FCC's descriptions are for nationwide purposes. What about non-fee requirements? And this is typically aesthetics. So this is what Christy was just talking about, and we can knock out number 2 because the courts have struck that. But you know, this is important because, well, you'll see as we get into some of the pictures. By golly, Christy, this one's yours.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. So there are 2 separate types of fees that have been outlined in the FCC order. One has to do with the pole attachment fees, which is how much a city can charge when you attach to city-owned infrastructure in the right-of-way. The other has to do with your application fees. So I did see one of the questions on the chat section for the in my case with the cities, and they have submitted for the cost study to support pole attachment amounts in excess of $270 had to do with a bunch of real estate calculations. It was kind of challenging to put together, but I can talk a little bit more about that. I think we have another slide, but we had different property values analysis that had been done, as well as maintenance costs that the city had indicated. But with respect to the other fees, the application fees, the safe harbor amount that the city, the FCC provided was about $100 or is $100 per application. As many of you are from local government, you know we can't even flush the toilet for $100. So most cities do not implement the $100 application fee. There's some, but most do not. And so what I've seen a lot of cities do as a way is to request a deposit, which is withdrawn from based on staff costs as they review and evaluate the application that's been submitted. As many of you know, I mean, even the first review can be very time consuming. That often results in a notice of incomplete. There's another submittal, and you might have to submit another notice of incomplete. And sometimes you may have to write 6 or 7 notices of incomplete. It seems pretty darn clear that that's going to cost in excess of $100. So some cities have some pretty substantial deposit systems that they use in order to recoup costs for incurred by the city that are costs that are incurred by the city in reviewing and processing these applications. So far, that has not been significantly challenged by the industry, and those costs are being paid. I can tell you that in my cities that we do get payment of the application costs that way. We do get the deposits, but it's often submitted under protest. Now, and it's supposed to, the cost for that permit should include all of your permit costs, but That's what the FCC order has said, but as you'll see in many of the way that these application permit deposits are set up, all of the costs are just withdrawn from the deposit, including your small wireless facility permit approval and the building permit approval, which they'll need to install. Next one.
All right, before we do that, Jack, I just came in on a second line because since I'm controlling the slides, I can't see the comments. If you'd promote that second one to presenter, I'll be able to see the comments. Thanks. All right, here we go. There we go.
And also, yes, Crown Castle is deploying small cells, a lot of them all over the place. And in some cases, we have had quite the kerfuffle with them on documents that have been submitted in support of their sites. It's not always the case that what the industry submits to you, and this is true, I'm sure, for all carriers in your experience, but not everything that we receive is actually accurate in terms of what is submitted. And we'll go into that a little bit later. But what happened with this FCC small cell order? Well, local governments were not thrilled. So they sued the FCC. In 2020, the Ninth Circuit heard the matter that was argued by local governments. And like I had earlier discussed, the cities were successful in getting the aesthetic regulation limitation overturned by the courts. The rest of the city's requests in terms of, pole attachment fees, application fees, and everything else that we just mentioned that largely limited cities' regulations of small wireless facilities did not get overturned by the courts. In that case, the court deferred to the FCC's expertise on those matters, and the FCC's 2018 order remained untouched.
I'll add a little crowing here, which is that as for the part of the regulation that was knocked out, it was my partner and our managing partner now, Trip May, who took lead on that. I'm very proud of him. So that's a bit of a disclosure and some crowing at the same time. Christy, you start here and then I'm supposed to add in.
Oh, okay. I thought okay. So
let's do it the other. Oh, that's right. My bad. Folks, we went through all of this as late as yesterday and we're reassigning stuff, and life goes on in spite of us. So look, the bottom line is that the industry has been marching across the country doing state-by-state regulation work because they have figured out that the FCC is not going to give them all that they want. And frankly, I think they're a little concerned about the fact that the current FCC, and especially once there's a third Democratic member, is not going to be as favorable to them as under the PI regime. So look, the bottom line is there is more regulation coming, more small regulation is coming. I think it's inevitable that we'll see more next year. Christy will spend just a moment talking about the most important piece of regulation that the governor vetoed this year.
Yeah, so that would be SB 556. This would have forced cities to allow, I guess we would have just been forced to have small wireless facilities on all city-owned infrastructure in the right-of-way. We wouldn't have had an approval denial. It would just, they would go up and that would be it. We would have had limited objective standards like building and safety standards, but otherwise all of if you own your utility poles, if you own your light standards, that could all be subject to having a small cell on it, despite how you felt about it. So while in the past it was advantageous to own, and sometimes advantageous to own all of your light standards and your utility poles, this would have made it pretty darn precarious for you if that's what situation you were in. This passed through the legislature like smooth sailing, very little objections from anybody. It was kind of shocking with how smooth it went. Thankfully for local government, on October 4th, Governor Newsom vetoed the legislation. So we are not stuck with it. But like Jonathan said, it's just a matter of time before we see it again.
When it does come back, one of the things to think about is whether your poles, light standards, whatever that they will have a right to attach to, were paid for by bonds. It's going to be one of the most important bases upon which lawsuits will happen. I'm sure of that. Let's move on to the shot clock. And this is just to give you an idea about from small wireless facilities, what we're dealing with shot clocks. As you know, the FCC overlaid on the PSA a number of years ago shot clocks as to how fast we have to do things. Well, this is the story for Swiffers and non-Swiffers, and then there'll be another shot clock coming in just a slide or two. But here's the bottom line. Once an application is submitted, and by the way, the threshold for submission is writing the word application, maybe in lipstick on the back of a cocktail napkin. The threshold is so low that almost anything starts it unless you've actually described how you start the administrative process. And that's day 0 when it's submitted. And you have 10 days to review the application for completeness. In virtually, we process, I don't know, somewhere around 1,000 wireless applications on behalf of jurisdictions in the last year or two. And the number of applications that are actually complete is a tiny fraction of that. So the first incomplete is the most important incomplete because under the FCC, we have the 1 byte rule. We'll talk about that a little bit more, where you only have 1 incomplete. You've got to stuff everything into that first incomplete. If you have, well, I'll wait till later to talk about multiple departments reviewing applications. So when the application comes back in, you basically one time reset the clock to 0 and then it moves forward. So you have another 10 days to incomplete. Everything has to be done in writing. You all know this. I'm not going to deep dive all of this stuff, but the most important thing is that those of you who think you have 30 days to incomplete under a small wireless facility, it's only 10. That's the key. The rest of this is not as important to understand because really the most important deadline is the 10-day clock. And then finally, under state law, as well as the FCC, if you don't take action on it by the 60th day, it's approved by operation of law. That's not a good idea. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. So surviving the shot clocks. We're really big on having various applications, not just one master application. And an application for a small wireless facility has different requirements than an application for 6409, which is different requirements than for a new site not subject to a small wireless facility or 6409. Commonly, you have about 5 applications now. The most recent application being for standby power generators, which we will cover in some length a little bit later on. But you've got to look for interesting things. You got to look for example, where you've got an applicant who wants to shoehorn in something for a small wireless facility at a non-compliant site. Well, that actually gets treated one way. Whereas if you're doing it under 6409, you might see an applicant say, hey, we want 6409. They've already modified the site without permission. They go back and modify it to bring it back to what it was approved. And that's the note there, the 2 legal wrongs don't create a legal right. We've actually seen that happen. The carriers are very creative to try and shoehorn into the best regulatory process. The 1 byte rule again, if it doesn't go into your first incomplete, you can't bring it back. You can't bring up something new later on. When about submitting appointments? The FCC has told us that the shot clock runs through weekends, holidays, snowstorms, hurricanes, tornadoes. So even though they don't run their own shot clocks that way, our shot clocks are 7 calendar days per calendar week. So most jurisdictions now are adopting regulations that say you can submit on Mondays and Tuesdays, because that way you don't lose 2 days over the weekend. We've seen so much gaming of the system where applicants come in and submit applications at 4:50 in the afternoon on Friday of a 3-day weekend. That's just silliness. A lot of you are asking are taking in applications by email now. It's still asking for trouble. How do you get your deposits? You can't say an application is not accepted because they didn't give you the money. That's simply incomplete. So it's important to have your processing process laid out, put it on paper so that people have a way of following a checklist. And finally, look, the goal here is, if an application does come in and it does meet all of your regulatory requirements, it meets your design standards, it's filed, you've got all the RF safety information you need. Ministerial approvals are the best process, because frankly, if it fits all the boxes, it's not going to be denied because of public concerns about RF, because as we all know, those public concerns are not things that we can take into account when we're reviewing applications. Surviving the shot clocks a little bit more here. This is really important for you, which is that the number of applications that we see jurisdictions having in their stale file. In other words, you sent the incomplete notice back to the applicant and then they disappeared on you. Well, it's still a live application. So in our creation of ordinances now, we're putting in a automatic withdrawal rule. Christy will have a comment about that in a second. An automatic withdrawal rule, so that if an application stays open for 60 days in an incomplete status, it's automatically dismissed as being, it's automatically withdrawn by the applicant. And this is to kill the zombies, because otherwise they continue to clog up and disrupt the process. And you could have, 100 applications come out of incomplete all at once. Christy, you want to talk about your thoughts on that? Because we have some different thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think, one of the reasons that I include these in our ordinances, this type of language, and there's different ways that you can kill the zombie, if you will. But I had a city, we would get tons of small wireless facility applications. We would deem them incomplete, send the notice of incomplete in a timely fashion, and not receive anything back for 6 or 7 months. Then we would review the second submittal, we would deem it incomplete, send a notice of incomplete, and not get anything back for 6 or 7 months. Fast forward to the 2018 FCC order. In the comments, it was alleged that my city took over 2 years to approve a permit. They failed to mention that most of that time was their fault, and so what ended up happening, in addition to those types of issues, we would get a new submittal 7 or 8 months later for a brand new location. It would be 500, 600 feet from the original application. So they were trying to also use this as a way to kind of game the shot clock. So as a result, what many of my cities do is, after it's there's been no response, it's written into the ordinance. If there has been no response to a notice of incomplete, oftentimes the application is simply denied. At the expiration of 60 days, the application is denied for being incomplete. And if they want to resubmit, they can, but they have to go through the process all over again, start the shot clock all over again, and pay a new permit fee. Now, I can't tell you the carriers are totally thrilled about this, but cities certainly aren't thrilled with having all of these, small wireless facility applications pending, because it's very difficult to manage all of these wireless applications, especially when many just sit stale like. So we do, in fact, deny it. I know Jonathan has a different approach. So if you can go over that, Jonathan.
Well, again, I think we simply dismiss, or we treat it as actually having the applicant withdraw the application as part of the application process. It says if you leave an application incomplete in terms of your response to us from an incomplete notice for 60, some jurisdictions 90, then your application is deemed withdrawn by you. This has happened a number of times already in jurisdictions that we certainly represent, and it freaks out the permit runners who don't bother to read the ordinance. But so far, it's remained unchallenged, and frankly, it's a good process that's needed to control the administration of all of this. I'm going to jump to the next topic, which comes into all this. So we had a situation, one of our jurisdictions, actually represented by Christie's firm, where we worked together on that client, where an application was actually denied for cause for a small cell in the right of way. And the carrier kind of sat on that for a number of months, and then they had their law firm write to the city and say, well, we want to enter into a tolling agreement so we can continue to discuss the site. Well, the city attorney for that jurisdiction said, are you kidding? That's ridiculous. Why would we enter into a tolling agreement to revive a site that does not exist? That was the goal. It was simply to create rights that had evaporated for the carriers. So don't do that. Finally, from the counter, never issue a complete letter or an incomplete letter or anything like that, because for the purposes of the 1 byte rule, you're killing yourself. So don't do that. Let's move on.
And Jonathan, if I could just jump in really quick before you move on to the generators, there's a comment in the chat, and it relates to, you know, how municipalities are choosing to handle these short timelines. And yeah, most cities have chosen to approve small wireless facilities ministerially, because the administrative process can be done much more quickly than, of course, the public hearing process. So I don't see small cells going to a public hearing, because you only have 60 days, as opposed to your macro sites, which are going to be, you know, you probably, depending on, but you probably have 150 days. So those do still go to planning commission or some sort of public hearing, in my experience, but small cells are done ministerially. With respect to appeals, though, it's often the case that because if it's the director who approves the small wireless facility permit, there are oftentimes an ability to an appeal, maybe to the city manager or some other member of the city workforce, or they just make the director decision final, which then you can go to the next steps after that, since there would be no appeal. But that's been my experience on how cities have handled the shot clock ruling. Jonathan, did you want to speak on that?
No, I think that's fine. We did have a couple of questions, and just let me hit on one, which is, did we see applicants gaming the resubmission rule to avoid the zombie killing rule? Yeah, of course. But a thoughtful rule regarding a deemed withdrawn or denied would include a provision that says that if an applicant makes an application to the director or whomever the approving authority is within 30 days before the action, then it reasonably can be extended, typically for another 30 days. But look, there's gaming everywhere, because there is so much pressure on the applicants to get these through our processes that anything will happen, including saying, well, I did send you a request, and the fact that you didn't receive it by email is your fault. It's one of the reasons why I don't like email submissions. Let's move on. We've got a lot still to cover, and we'll make sure we keep you within the time frame that we promised. And we're going to switch now to AB 2421. Many of you know about this. Some of you probably don't. This is regarding standby power generators, and we're expecting to see these at small cell sites because, as you'll see, the rules do actually permit it. They're not restrictive to keep it out. So I feel the power. What's a standby power generator? This is an example of one, and this is actually relatively small, especially in Christy's world, because she's seen much larger generators. But this is a standby power generator. This one, by the way, is propane. You'll notice by the pipe coming up at the bottom center. This is from one of our client sites at a mountaintop, and the purpose of these is to provide standby power during commercial power outages. Not that PG&E, SDG&E, or SCE ever fail, much less LADWP or any of the other agencies. But the carriers feel that this is very important stuff, and we get it. So let's spend a few minutes and talk about this so that you understand the scope of it and, frankly, the most important parts of it. And this is the actual government code section. The code section actually goes into long details, but I've highlighted the most important parts for you to think about. So we're talking about stationary standby power generators, and I'll have a picture at the end here of what is not a stationary standby power generator, at least in my view. And that these go at macrocell sites. Now, as we haven't said yet, but I'll say it now, you can have a small cell at a macro cell site co-located. That is absolutely within the scope of the ability of a carrier to apply for a small cell. And again, because they do mix and match to figure out the best regulatory approval, sometimes they won't do 6409 because under 6409, something you'll see in the next slide really has a problem for them. But this rule does not apply to macro cell tower sites that are on rooftops or small cells. That's okay. Remember, I said you can have them co-located, or outdoor or indoor distributed antenna systems. DAS systems are, for example, you'll see that at stadiums or inside malls, things like that. So it says that these are for macro tower sites. For AB 2421 to apply, all the following have to apply, but the most important one here is number 2, the macro cell tower site at which the emergency standby generator is proposed to be installed is an existing site that was previously permitted, my highlighting, by the applicable local agency. In our experience, roughly now 50% of the sites we review on behalf of our government clients have been modified without permit. And if they've been modified without permit, then it is not the site that was previously permitted. And this is a vitally important escape clause that takes standby power generators out of this frankly ministerial, almost impossible to deny process, and puts it back into a proper review. And why is that important? It's because standby power generators, even at camouflage sites under 2421, don't have to be camouflaged. So if you can pull out of 2421, you want the generator because we want the reliable communications, but you want it also to be applicable and consistent with the design of the site as it exists. And a lot of red here. Red is bad. We have a new shot clock. And it's a different, and because gosh, it's a different shot clock. So we have to approve or deny the application for the generator within 60 days of the submittal. But here's a new wrinkle. We have a 10-day incomplete, but then it stops the clock. It stops the clock. And not only do we have to do an incomplete, but now the state has told us that we have to indicate the manner in which they can be made complete. In other words, we just say, like, you didn't provide the plans. Now we have to say you have to provide the plans, and including a list and thorough description of the specific information needed to complete the application. The plans have to have this. It has to be this size. It has to be that. In any subsequent review of the application determined to be complete, the local government shall not request the applicant to provide any new information that was not stated in the initial list of items that were not complete. That's craziness. The one nice thing is that, frankly, I think by a weird drafting process, upon receipt of any resubmittal, a new 60-day period shall begin, during which the local agency shall determine the completeness of the application, which means 10 days to determine the completeness again. So it's a weird circular clock. And since they said we couldn't ask for any more information before, now they're saying it again. The local agency shall not require any new or different information for permit applications that routinely requires for applications for other emergency standby generators. In other words, if you have a set of specifications for standby power generators at hospitals, things like that, we can't ask for more because, you know, hospitals are right in the middle of residential communities, and gosh, noise wouldn't be a concern. So think about that. Let's move on to the last one of this. Oh no, still got a little bit more after this. And there's a deemed approved process in the regulations that if we don't take an action within 60 days, it's deemed approved. We have some rights that were reserved about revoking for violations, things like that, which is good and kind of that's there anyway. Yes, I've got one more slide after this on generators, and then we'll get back into something a little bit more palatable. If you require multiple permits to be issued for a standby power generator, everything has to be issued within the same 60-day period. So in other words, if you have a fire permit, if you have a wastewater issue, all of those things have to be considered and subject to approval or denial within the same 60-day period. Now, here's a real interesting stinker that, gosh, every city really loves. The local agency shall not require the applicant to submit proof of consent or other authorization from an underlying property owner as part of the initial application for a standby power generator permit. What? No LOA? You want us to process an application that burdens the property and it adds restrictions to the property and the landlord doesn't even know it? Yeah, that's exactly what that says. And in fact, our firm, like Christy's firm, also represents jurisdictions and others in as landlords, and they get real surprised when they find out when they get a copy of an application filing from a local jurisdiction. They find out that their property is being applied for a standby power generator, and they have no information about it. The second part right here talks about how that gets handled. Basically it says if it does get approved before it can be installed, if the jurisdiction requires it, then you need the LOA. From a landlord perspective, because many of you have cell sites on your property, this is not mandatory approval if it's outside the scope of your lease or outside the scope of the premises. So if you find that you've had an application approved for a standby power generator at one of your sites, don't just sign off on it. Look at your lease and see if it still applies. Finally, in this section, we're allowed to include our costs, and those costs are whatever is reasonable. That's whatever your internal costs are. If you have external reviews, that's fine too. Shall not be levied for general revenue purposes. Well, duh, because we can't do that. The law currently has a sunset of January 1st, 2024. At that point, it's repealed. I'm pretty darn sure it's going to be extended. I think that the law will probably be extended and amended to make it even better for the industry if our legislature is who we think they are. But right now there is a sunset. Sections 3 and 4 are the usual. You've already seen them a zillion times. Statewide concern, no reimbursement. And no reimbursement from the state is because we have a way of collecting fees from the applicant. So what is not a stationary generator for the purposes of this? As weird as it sounds, it's this. And this is, while it's stationary in a sense, it can be moved. It's not permanently installed. So this hasn't become an issue in any jurisdiction that I know of yet, but I'm sure it will. So this is probably not an AB 2421 generator. And more interestingly is the question is, was there any notice or anything to this jurisdiction when this generator was put in? I happen to know the answer because we work for that jurisdiction. They had no clue that this was done. And we had another client, a water district, where one of these was installed and then it started leaking diesel fuel into the ground. And the client was not all that happy, especially since it was at a underground water tank. Yeah.
And Jonathan, if I can echo some of your comments, like Jonathan was saying, the client was unfamiliar with the fact that this generator was on property. And so that kind of goes to this legislation's requirement that the existing site be approved. The reason that's crucial is because not all sites have been approved at all. I have one city where the public works director took a jog through the city looked up and found out that a small wireless facility had been installed on a utility pole over the weekend without any permits. So that would not, they would not be able to avail themselves, you know, to a generator for a macro site if there was some sort of approval that they had missed. For macro sites, it's often modifications that should have been approved. And that's true for small cells as well. So it's always crucial when you're looking at whether you have to administratively approve this generator, you need to confirm that the existing site has been fully and completely approved. They have not modified it without permits, because it's very common for that to happen. This is also the type of analysis you do for eligible facilities requests, because again, things will be modified. If they modify it and they don't have the approval, they are not eligible for the protections of the legislation, AB 2421, or the protections under the eligible facilities request.
Exactly right. 50% of the sites, again, 50% of the sites we look at are non-compliant with their permits. All right, so let's look at some small cell wannabes. And what I'm talking about here, by the way, we're going to help you rest your eyes for a little bit from all the text, but we're going to look at facilities that are or could be small cells, because one of the things the FCC has said is that it's the equipment volume, not the camouflage. So here's a wireless site. It was actually not built as a small cell, but it could be. By the way, this is a good design that was worked out so that the applicant could get that pop-up, and then they added the clock at the city's request because that was the way of making it a public benefit and not looking weird. Could this be a small cell? Sure. Here's another design that could easily be a small cell. It's not built as a small cell, but what I want to show you here is that design of the camouflage is not part of the 28 cubic feet of equipment. The next slide is for Christy. Absolutely one of her favorites.
I don't know if you can see it, but there's a small cell there, but it's conveniently camouflaged by that super well-sized flag. There are 1,000 things wrong with this. It's not painted to match. It's very noticeable. And, you know, it has not been aesthetically designed to obscure or camouflage it. Instead, what they've proposed or installed as a camouflage actually brings more attention, I think, to it. You can also see exposed cabling at the base, which none of that should be visible. We've got GPS antennas to the right, as well as what appears to be the top of the equipment shelter. All of that should not be visible. It should be painted to match. All of this should be behind a parapet, or like the beautiful site Jonathan showed you, like within a clock or some other architectural element, so that it doesn't look so terrible.
Oops, sorry.
And that's it.
Oh, what about the weenie flag? Remember, we talked about the weenie flag?
Yes, yeah, it's poorly sized, for sure. You know, not that you want to bring more attention to this site by putting something, you know, red, white, and blue and waving in the wind. But even if it had been proposed as a flagpole camouflage, that is not what they accomplished here.
And now this site, the reason why we included this site is because this was actually put in as a macro cell site, but under the FCC's small wireless facility, I'm sorry, under the Swiffer rules, it would have been built as a Swiffer as well. Again, I've already said it, so I won't beat it up again, but you can have co-locations of small cells with macro cells. By the way, look for that with Dish. As Dish starts to deploy, a number of their facilities appear to be qualified for small cells. And in terms of design, here's another small cell design. This is actually in Seattle, Washington. We have an office up there, and one of our attorneys that's based there is, so this was an interesting design they're deploying now in Seattle. The thing to note about this is look at the flying conduits off the pole. Particularly attractive. Here's an interesting site that qualifies as a small cell. This is a 3-sector site built on a light standard. I think many of you have not seen something like that. The equipment is contained in the ground box there. That's 22.5 cubic feet. Christy, you had a comment about this yesterday, about what's at the base.
I don't recall the comment.
Oh,
Oh, the trash can is a trash can.
the trash can is a trash can. And the reason why we're pointing that is actually there are some sites that are built with the equipment in a faux trash can. Some small cell sites that are built with that now.
It actually looks pretty good, in my
it-
opinion, Jonathan.
It does. And others in faux mailboxes, things like that. So
Mhm.
this is just to give you a sense of the box that you just saw. Where else can you find small cells, that things that qualify as small cells? Here's an example of what would qualify as small cells. This is south of Point Magoo on Pacific Coast Highway. Christy, you had a thought about this one.
Yeah, so as you can see, we've got a top mounted small cell on the right. It's slimline, same, width of the pole, relatively innocuous. And as you can see, the boxes are part of that, the cap. I'm blinking out the
radome.
The radome above. So it does appear to be well done. And on the right, however, is a utility pole side mount. Now, a lot of times cities do not like top mounting on utility poles because a top mount on a utility pole is, 65 feet in the air, whereas, your light standards are usually about 25 feet. So side mounts are definitely more popular when it comes to utility poles. What's the problem with this one? Well, for one, it's absolutely hideous. You've got exposed cabling, that has not even been attempted to be put within a canister or concealed. The boxes are side mounted as well, which is curious. Normally you would want those pole mounted to make it more streamlined and less obvious to your residents or members of your public. And I know that typically they do want about 5 feet off the utility pole in order to make it effective and for it to work. But there's no reason why you need the boxes to be side mounted in the way in which they're mounted there. As the boxes also have exposed cabling, all of that should be within the box and concealed. And to the extent that there's conduit, as you can see, it kind of flies off the pole there. It's a little difficult to see, but the conduit is not aligning, or it's not flush to the pole as it should be. So this site, it could have been much better done.
We tend to name sites within our company, and we call the one on the left the pencil eraser site. The one on the right, remember as you're growing up that the dunking flamingo that would drink water, then pop back up and down and back up and down and back up? That's what this reminds me of on the right-hand side. Here's an interesting one. Some of the deployments we're seeing now have strand-mounted radios, and the arrow's pointing to actually a 2-sector site, 2 antennas mounted on the strand. The public expects to see stuff on the strand because they're used to seeing cable TV and fiber enclosures and some taps for telephone services. So this is one of those interesting things where this is actually probably less visible than putting it out on an arm. By the way, that 3-legged device at the bottom, that's actually cable TV. That's a cable TV Wi-Fi. So, this is stuff that we do see up in the strand. Now, another interesting design for small cells is this one. And these two designs are functionally, electronically the same thing. It's simply how they're packaged. This gets to the point about having aesthetic regulations. The one on the right was the first one, the first generation. We call that the spear gun. It's mobility for the Sprint network, which is likely to be decommissioned by T-Mobile. The one on the left is, we call it the fanny pack. But everything that's in the right hand visible is in the left hand as well. Another type of small cell that actually predates the FCC's rules but qualifies as a small cell is this Philips Smart Pole. And it's a small cell. It qualifies as a small cell, and you can tell that because there are even smaller people down at the base of it. Interestingly, those bases are commonly empty. Most of the time, these poles don't have any radios in them. The radios themselves are located up in the top radome, right adjacent to the antennas. From my perspective, this is nothing more than a hideous design, and luckily, they don't seem to be deployed anymore. So we're going to now shift to the next subject, which is something that starts on January 1st. So you've got to be aware of it. We're going to get down and dirty in the micro trenches.
Excellent.
Oh,
Thanks, Jonathan.
I can hear you all groaning about that now.
So, it's interesting when me and Jonathan were talking about it yesterday. I have some clients that aren't totally adverse to microtrenching and some that are totally adverse to microtrenching. And how do you feel about it? The reality is it really doesn't matter because the state has decided for you on how you're going to manage microtrenching. Thanks to SB 378, which was passed earlier this year and will be effective, like Jonathan said, January 1st of 2022. And what does the legislation say? Well, the legislation says that you have to accept microtrenching and you have to basically modify your codes to allow for it. And so what is a microtrench? If you haven't seen one already, it's where they drill a small line into your right-of-way, into the asphalt, usually right near the sidewalk. Here, the state has defined microtrenching as deeper than 12 inches, but no deeper than 26 inches. It also can't be any wider than 4 inches. So if that gives you a sense of how small the trench would be in your right-of-way, hopefully you can visualize that. Now, you could imagine that there are many public works officials out there that do not want this because it interferes with the integrity of your right-of-way. There isn't things in this legislation that deals with newly paved roads, for example. And many cities have trenching ordinances that have time periods in which you have to wait when you want to trench into a brand new right-of-way. So this has been very concerning for cities. This relates to small wireless facilities. It relates to all wireless facilities because this is how fiber gets from or gets to the site. So this is going to impact all of that as well as other fiber, such as cable, telephone lines, etc. So you're going to want to pay attention to this and how it unfolds next year. It is, if to the extent that your existing ordinances are not consistent with this legislation, you are going to have to bring forward an ordinance to reconcile that with this existing state law. Now, you can actually deny microtrenching, but the city does need to make a specific finding that there'll be an adverse impact on the public health and safety. What that means, I don't think anybody really knows what would be sufficient under this law to establish an adverse impact on the public health and safety. So as we watch this unfold, it'll be interesting to see what cities do in making that finding, how courts deal with that when cities make that finding and then are subsequently challenged by the industry. And so we'll be watching this closely throughout the year. And hopefully we'll be able to report back a little bit on this topic when we are at our annual conference this spring.
We had a quick comment, which I think is delightful, from Adam Handel at Santa Barbara. I assume that's Santa Barbara. Maybe San Bernardino, who knows? What licensed civil engineer approved AB 378 at the state level? Gads, that's a great question. Obviously, the answer is none, most likely, because it was approved by the legislature at the behest of the industry. And in terms of public health or safety, I think we have to be focusing on diminution of road life, things like that. I don't know that that's going to count. And Christy talked about effectively, what about street cut moratoriums? And the answer is that the FCC has told us that no moratoriums apply anywhere. So what you should be thinking about is block to block repaving if you're in a moratorium. That would be the same thing you'd probably be doing if you had someone cutting into a Petromat or an equivalent type of foundation that was warranted. Christy, you've got the next one here as well.
Yeah, so the legislation does go on to say that if the parties agree, the city and the industry agree, the microtrench can actually be shallower than 12 inches in depth. I have never seen that happen, or any city willing to approve that or even entertain this idea, but it's there. So if you want to allow something at 10 inches or 8 inches in depth, you can. I mean, you could also have them lay it right on top of the right of way too, if you wanted to, because it's your street. But this is what the legislation allows you to do. As I said before, you are going to be required to amend your existing policies or ordinances to allow for this type of micro trenching to occur with the depths that have been outlined by the legislation, which is, essentially more than 12 inches, not more than 26 inches, right? So go ahead, a lot of cities have right-of-way policies in addition to an ordinance or a title in their zoning code that relate to the regulation of the right-of-way. And so both of those need to be considered, evaluated, and revised to meet this new legislation. So that come January, you can hit the ground running. Otherwise, you're going to have some limitations on what you can and cannot enforce. Without having a revised ordinance in place, you can't deal with what could be the potential fallout of you not being able to impose your existing code.
Yeah, this all really stinks. Now, as for the provision here, number 2, about this micro trench shallower than 12 inches, I have a suspicion, but it's only a suspicion, is that some companies like Sci-Fi added this in, because those of you who are dealing with Sci-Fi, and I'm sorry, are learning that Sci-Fi likes 8-inch depth, which creates all sorts of other problems for maintaining your own roads. But I think that's the only reason it's there. And why would any jurisdiction be crazy enough to put a stinker in there that would allow it for less than 12 inches? Look, for those of you who don't have consistent codes, you're going to have to make the amendment. In fact, the law directs you to do it.
Correct. So in addition to amending your code, you also want to look at what type of application costs that you have or permit costs that you have in place to ensure that you're able to recover your fees. Since some cities, have historically prohibited microtrenching, you're going to need to look at that, because you probably don't have a fee mechanism or structure in place for these types of applications. So that's something to look at when you're looking at the at your ordinance and policy. As you can see highlighted in red, it says that you can also recoup any costs that were incurred if the applicant elects to expedite the processing and review of the microtrenching application. Many cities don't have we can't expedite the processing. It is what it is. We have a finite number of warm bodies in the Public Works Department, a finite number of hours in the day. And so this is not an option in most cities. But if you have that in your city, then you can also recoup those costs.
The concern that I have here is that the regulation doesn't talk about an expediting process under a local rule. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see applicants coming in saying, we demand an expedited processing and review. We'll pay for it, but we demand it. It's unclear as to what that means in terms of the context of that subsection C there. Right, let's move on. Let's move on to making sausage. And the sausage here is the processing of wireless, small wireless facility sites, and generally cell sites too. We're going to cover a lot of stuff that may surprise you, may not. And let's start with fiber. Look, Christy, Christy, why don't you, we didn't plan for you to take this one, but why don't you take this one first? You remember what we were talking about yesterday on this?
Well, I mean, this is, not allowing them to build to nowhere. The way that Jonathan says is, they file an application to a piece of dirt. So what we mean is that it's often the case that small wireless facility deployments will be installed, in my opinion, backwards. They will ask for a fiber permit to build fiber in your right of way. That fiber is intended to service a small wireless facility, let's say at a light standard. Okay, but the small wireless facility has not been approved. And it's not clear whether the small wireless facility will be approved. But meanwhile, they're tearing up in your right of way and putting fiber in. We've had cases where that's exactly what happened, only to have the small wireless facility not get approved and actually be moved, 600 feet or so, out of the way, meaning they had to go back into the right of way, tear up the right of way again, interfere with our businesses and our residents, creating a massive amount of work, disruption, and just quite honestly, it's just a real pain in everyone's side. So nobody likes this. That nobody wants them to, install the fiber before getting an approval on the small wireless facility. As a result, I write ordinances that say if that you're not allowed to get a fiber permit until the small wireless facility has been approved. And during the permit process, what we require is the industry, if they have a fiber only permit, they have to submit a declaration or some sort of letter saying that that fiber permit is for a fiber only installation and is not intended to service a small wireless facility. If it's only fiber, then it goes forward as an only fiber permit. If it's intended to service a small wireless facility, we will review, process, and approve it, but the approval will be conditioned upon the approval of the small wireless facility. So they can't build until the SWIFT has been approved by the city, which prevents them from, basically, installing fiber to nowhere.
Yeah, this gets into interesting things like piecemealing and things like that. But the bottom line is that the industry says, look, we are a regulated PUC telephone corporation. We can build anywhere we want and suck it. So don't be surprised if you hear that, especially from companies that consider themselves to be royalty living in royal homes.
Yeah, and I shared with Jonathan an experience I had in one city. We have this process in place where they do have to send a letter saying, it's a fiber only permit. What city staff learned was that, in fact, this fiber only permit, which they clearly had asserted that's what it was, city staff learned that, in fact, it was being installed to service a small wireless facility. When we brought this up with the carrier, we were told, oh, it's a big company. The right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. At which point I quickly reminded him that if a small city like mine could figure it out, a large organization like theirs should be able to handle these much better. So even if you have a process like this in place to try to prevent them from building fiber to nowhere, you still need to do your due diligence. It may not be the case that the documentation you're receiving is accurate.
Okay, let's move on. We're getting there. I think we're still pretty good on time, and appreciate your questions that are coming in on the chat. So look, the goal of this is that we want to minimize what goes into the right of way. We want to reduce the amount of street furniture for aesthetic and for public safety reasons. So as part of your regulation should encourage, if not required to the extent possible, WTRs, wireless telecom rate power connections. Mini meters in Northern California are, they look like small mushrooms that are actually power meters that are remotely read. Anything you can do to remove or reduce the footprint in the right of way is a good thing. Where flush mounting is possible, it's good. Obviously water tables are an issue, but a lot of places where water table is just not an issue. So let's talk about a typical small cell that is installed now in the right of way. It's very common to see this type of application coming in where you have a light standard, and then you'll have a new light standard put in about 3 feet away that has the small wireless facility built onto it. This is a typical detail, but then you get into some interesting problems, and we see this not often, but enough that it's a surprise, which is you see, and especially in legacy or in older cities that have smaller sidewalks, where in fact the new pole is set in such a way as you can't get ADA clearance. And that's a real bad situation. So that falls under our it's never going to happen ADA shot clock. But always be looking for ADA violations when you're dealing with new facilities. And as surprisingly, And this is for Bill Sanders especially. It's not in his jurisdiction, but he's the one who taught me about this so many years ago, is inverse condemnations. This is another, it's never going to happen shot clock, where you have part of the facility overhanging private property. If you don't have a approval by the private property owner to do this, then this is a real problem that you've got to avoid. Now, the next section is not going to surprise any of you who know me, because you know that this is something that I deal with, and frankly, you all deal with. Is it safe? And I'm not going to do a deep dive about RF safety, but I'm going to tell you what you need to be thinking about in terms of RF safety, especially related to small cells. And by the way, in this picture, there are two, count them, two small cells. This is this is in city of Santa Monica, actually pretty close to where I live. And this is a Verizon 3-cell small cell. I'm sorry, 3-sector small cell. There are 3 radios there. And then this is an AT&T design right here on this one. This raises a separate point, which I'll just touch on briefly now, which is that we are seeing deployments where you're having multiple small cells per block. It's what we expected. It's going to be migrating more from the main streets like Wilshire Boulevard, which is what this is on, into the residential areas. It is what it is. So are they safe? Well, the answer is, for small cells, most of the time, they're going to easily comply, but you still have to have it in the record. You don't just accept from the carrier that it is safe. You need to have an RF analysis done to show. And the reason is that, and here's an example of small cells on a building. You can have a small cell on a building. And this is where RF safety for small cells is going to come into play for the most part. It's where you have a facility on a building that qualifies as a small cell. It could be for all intents and purposes. But here's an important thing. Small cells are not small power. There is nothing in the rules that can relate a small cell to small power. And in fact, we see substantial power coming out of small cells. So the RF rules do apply. They should be analyzed. And especially when you have a small cell on an existing structure that is, for example, like this on a building where it's on an equipment penthouse, you can walk in front of it. You can have RF controlled zones. Those have to be taken into account in terms of the permitting process. So the question is not, is it safe? And you all know this, is it compliant with the FCC rules? If it is, then it's no longer within our purview. This is going to be a continuing problem for residents who are concerned about 5G, because everything on the internet is true. But for you, if you're maintaining your own light standards, do you have rules that talk about maintenance? This one, the picture is cut off just by necessity, but above that, you can obviously see that there's a luminaire. So when you have your own people maintaining your poles and you've got small cells on them, you have to have a protocol to permit your employees to work safely around transmitting facilities. And that's normally a protocol that requires that the carrier turn off the facility while you're working on it, while you're working on the pole. That's all I'm going to say about RF, because the rest of it, if you have specific questions, just reach out and talk to us. Christy and I are happy to talk to you about it. But it is still an issue. It is not something that doesn't apply to small cells. All right, this is Blossom. Blossom's my new dog, and I wanted to give her a picture, give her credit on the slideshow. But we're going to look now at small cells and compliance issues that you want to consider, and strap in for it. And we have some pretty pictures to show you. This is a small cell facility with multiple antennas on a light standard. This is in downtown Los Angeles. Here's another design. It's we call this the light standard, carefully designed to be camouflaged as a cell site, with 3 levels of antennas. You've got the antenna at the top in the radome. That's actually a 3-sector antenna, and 2 more antennas here, and then antennas on the side of the equipment box. Here's another flavor, in this case, where the radios are below the light arm. Again, think back to what I just said a few minutes ago about making sure that your employees that are working on the lights are protected. This is an OSHA issue, as pure as it can be. So having the protocols in place as part of the approval process is really important. Here's an example of two different designs, one pole apart and or one span apart here. The one up on the strand, you've already seen a picture of it. Interestingly, you'll notice the antenna, instead of pointing down the street, is pointing to the 90 degrees off of what the other one showed before. And as interestingly, the one on the right-hand side, we call it the crayon jammed on a pole design. That one's a AT&T cell site. So design standards are really important. Oops. Sorry. Here are 3 different small cell designs in the span of effectively one block. This one is T-Mobile. That's pretty decent. I think you'll all agree with that. Here's an older mobility, and then here's an AT&T one. Here's a fun one. I took a picture of in New Orleans. This is a site that was built by, I believe it was by Crown Castle. And this is the design you see throughout the French Quarter of New Orleans. For me, what's an interesting situation here is that the antennas are right at the level of this rooftop where you can walk, where people can walk. So from an RF safety standpoint, I would be conditioning the hell out of this one to protect the people who would have access to the roof. Who would have access to the roof? The building owner. You can see it's a shingled roof, so the people who maintain the roof, people who'd be working on the gutters, if there are gutters in front of it. That's it. Now for Bill Sanders, again, here are some interesting designs that we had this on the first slide. For those of you who came in late, we had a similar design. This is a brand new Verizon design. My apologies. I broke my own rule. And I'm sure I just missed a phone call about my auto warranty expiring. Oh, well, life goes on. So here's a delightful Verizon design. This is here in the city of Los Angeles in a residential community. Pretty amazing. I'm sure all of you would like to have a design like this in your community. Here's another of the same flavor in the same community. And gosh, it's something to be proud of. Interestingly here, look at the fact that the shrouds here are there's so much cabling coming out of it that the shrouds are to hide that, including this one up here on the top. All the antennas are inside the radome there. This was not built as a small cell, but it easily could be this type of design. This is in South Orange County, where it theoretically replaces a light standard in this parking lot with I think it's important to make sure that the cell sites have a good ocean view, because they're going to be looking at the ocean for a long time. Another design, again, a 2-on-1. We have the pole topper, and then down below it, a strand mount. So we're going to move into the next section. We're getting towards the very end of the lecture. We'll have enough time for your questions and answers. So please get ready. We're probably 5 or 7 minutes away from Q&A at this point. So negotiating and compliance, those are the 2 questions that we always deal with as local government people. How do we deal with these things? How do we have our processes developed so that we have the safety valves put in, we have the right approaches to processing, and when we're fighting with the applicants, we have a good basis to fight, and hopefully we don't have any bodies laying around as a result. I took this picture at the elephant seal habitat north of San Simeon. It just struck me as being so reminiscent of dealing with applicants across the counter. Christy liked this picture a lot yesterday. Christy, it's your turn.
Awesome. So now that we have been, dealing with these small cells for a while, many of you have experienced them. We've seen, kind of the good and the bad happen throughout the deployment. And it did not slow down during the pandemic. We continue to see multiple applications coming in daily in all of our various jurisdictions. So what have we learned? What do we want to make sure that we've taken care of as we come into the next year? And what do we do to improve our local environment when it comes to wireless facilities? So first, how much does your permit cost? That needs to be very carefully considered. If you're going to have a permit fee, just a straight permit fee, you need to make sure that you're evaluating all costs that would be incurred. That includes your public works staff, your planning staff, city manager, if he reviews, the director review, your legal analysis. If you have a consultant, those costs need to be included. All of it needs to be put together and established. I would recommend that you do your cost study for the permit fee in writing and that you keep it on file so that if you're ever challenged, you can have something in writing to establish exactly what the fee came from, as opposed to simply adding it to your fee schedule. I mean, eventually you would have to have it added to your fee schedule, but make sure your cost study is very detailed. And also envisions multiple notices of incomplete, since that is often the case. As Jonathan mentioned earlier when talking about the shot clock, they are able to initiate the shot clock on a napkin sketch, which is often what happens. And so then you're charged with telling them what they need to submit. Now, one of the most important things is the aesthetic standards. As you heard under the FCC 2018 order and the subsequent legal challenges, the one thing that the cities did win on in that case was the ability to implement their own aesthetic standards. So you want to make sure that you spend almost all of your time thinking about what the aesthetic standards should look like. In looking at the pictures that Jonathan went through with you, you can see why the aesthetic standards are so important, because if you don't have those aesthetic standards, you have the possibility of ending up with one of those very unsightly wireless facilities that Jonathan had showed us, as opposed to some of the very nicely done wireless facilities that Jonathan showed us. So these aesthetic standards need to have a lot of consideration, thoughts about how your city is built out. Obviously, things are going to affect how these things are deployed in your city. Things such as topography, demand, major thoroughfares is a key part of the demand. It's not just population. So you definitely want to spend time on your aesthetic standards. We're allowed to do it. So you want to implement these strictly. Keep in mind that, with the ugly sites that you saw, sometimes it's simply because, members of the city staff didn't know they should ask for more. They just took an application in, they saw that it worked, and sometimes this happens more on the public works side because aesthetics is something that's very much in the bailiwick of planners, but not so much when we hit the right of way. So make sure that everyone from public works to planning understands that an aesthetic review needs to be done to ensure that this proposed installation is compatible with your existing community. What happens and what we've learned is that you're not going to get the moon unless you ask for it. You need to push back and ask for a site that you want to look at. And until you get a site that you like, you don't want to stop pushing. The best way to get the site that you want initially is to have stringent aesthetic standards in a resolution, which we'll talk about in just a little bit more. But in order to process this appropriately and seeing what they're proposing and how you help them design it to your liking has to start with your application. The application has to be as detailed as possible. As Jonathan was talking about with respect to the shot clocks, there's a one bite at the apple rule. Your first notice of incomplete is a very significant, which means that your application really needs to be detailed. It has to ask for everything that you could possibly want. You can leave it to, sometimes it's the case that your application is requesting further documentation that may not be applicable to the site, but just let the carrier tell you that is not applicable, because you want to make sure that every piece of information you could possibly use as your evaluation, you have. In the case of small cells, you only have 60 days to review or approve or deny the site, and you only have 10 days every time you get a submittal. So you're going to need to move quickly, and having a detailed application will allow you to do that. You are going to need a good process for how you accept applications. Jonathan spoke to this a little bit earlier. It is because you only have 10 days, emails can be difficult. It also doesn't, with emails, you can't really slow the intake of what you're getting emailed with. So there's a number of different ways that cities have chosen to try to slow down the number of applications that have come in. Some include things like you have to make an appointment to submit an application, and other different mechanisms so as to prevent a carrier from submitting 45 applications for for wireless facilities on Friday, and then you have 10 days to respond to all of those applications. So there's different techniques that have been used, and so you need to think about what your process is and how you can absolutely ensure that when an application comes in, that it is being reviewed and responded to within the 10 days.
I'm going to jump in for a second and just clarify something that Christy just said, which is our goal here is not to limit the applications. Our goal is to have an orderly process. And she and I spent a lot of time talking about this yesterday, but I want to make sure that everybody's clear that we're not talking about limiting applications. We're talking about having a process where you can actually meet your obligations to process timely applications that do come in. We have one jurisdiction, and they're on the call today, and welcome, that it's in the process of receiving about 150 applications for small cells from one particular carrier. And the process that was adopted there was actually a negotiated permitting process that falls outside the direct rules, but was done for an orderly purpose. So don't forget that you can ask for it. These are rights that the carriers have, and most of the thoughtful carriers who are interested in getting their applications approved, as opposed to just stuffing them into a jurisdiction, will work with you. But it's just what Christy said. You got to ask. You got to ask.
Correct.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jonathan. One of the things, about, working for cities, our city staff, they're human. Things are going to happen.
What? Oh, okay.
People make mistakes. It's hard to meet the 10-day deadline. There's, it's hard to make the 60-day shot clock. There are a lot of moving parts when it comes to these facilities. And most cities don't have someone who is dedicated to just processing wireless, which means that person who is in charge of processing wireless also has 1,000 other applications on his desk or her desk that need to be reviewed. And so it's a very concerning or can be a very concerning process or difficult process to navigate. And you have to build in things in your ordinance that anticipate a misstep by your staff. So what is recommended, because the legislation has a deemed approval process throughout the generators or your small wireless facilities, you want to write in language for anything that does get automatically deemed approved by virtue of maybe blowing the shot clock. These regulatory requirements in your ordinance will then apply even if someone missteps and the site doesn't get fully evaluated by your staff and becomes deemed approved. Those regulatory requirements in your ordinance would then apply to this installation. So you have not lost all of your ability to regulate this site. So it's strongly recommended that you include those in an ordinance.
This would specifically include things like of compliance with the aesthetic regulations. You can imagine why that would be important.
Absolutely.
Let's move on. We're almost at the end, but want to make sure we have a little time for Q&A.
Yeah. So just one last slide from me. You want to make sure your ordinance requires that they pay you before you issue the permit. It's going to be much harder to get them to pay you after you issue the permit. Like we talked about with these zombie applications, you want to dismiss, deny, or otherwise have the stale application withdrawn so as to just put it to bed, right? Then developing a shot clock tracking system for the projects. If you remember anything about today's presentation, you have 10 days. Every time there's a submittal, you have 10 days. And it is like a chess clock. I'm not quite sure why the FCC chose to call it a shot clock, because it's more like a chess clock. It starts when you get a submittal. It stops when you issue your notice of incomplete. It starts again when you get a resubmittal. It stops again when you issue your notice of incomplete, and it keeps going that way. So whatever system that you use, make sure it's implemented and that everybody knows how to use that tracking system. If it does not meet the definition of a small wireless facility, like we talked about, if the antennas are larger than 3 cubic feet, then it's not going to be a small wireless facility. If you're not, this is likely, but if your equipment boxes are larger than 28 cubic feet, then it's not a small wireless facility. So make sure that you check to see if in fact it is a small wireless facility. If it's not, process it as a regular macro site, which is subject to 150 days.
Or 90, just depending on if it's on an existing or if it's a new site.
Correct. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
And most of my cities, and it is largely recommended that you do your aesthetic standards, your design standards in a resolution or policy and not in an ordinance. And the reason is that, as you can see from these sites, they went from really bad to much better. And a lot of that has happened recently. As a result of cities making demands on the carriers, saying we're not going to accept these ugly cell sites anymore. We want it to look better. And so the industry had to respond in kind. And so now your design standards that you may have adopted like 2 years ago needs to be revised, and it needs to be revised quickly. If you do that as an ordinance, you have to do a first reading, a second reading, and you have to wait for 30 days of effectiveness. Technology, aesthetics, the FCC, all of that is moving very quickly, and the city has to be able to keep up with that. A resolution can be adopted on your consent calendar and implemented immediately. And like we talked about earlier, the FCC order simply said that our aesthetic designs have to be published in advance. There is no requirement that they be adopted by ordinance.
Yeah, the industry is going to tell you you have to do it by ordinance. Tell them to suck it. Let's move on. By the way, that's the legal term, suck it. This is my personal measuring tape. I carry it in my car and I use it at every site that I visit. Well, almost every site. This is because we don't trust applicants, because they will not tell us the truth all the time, and you have to go out and verify. So you need to, when you're out looking at sites, as you should be as public works officials, as planners for enforcement purposes, measure it out, see if it's actually in the right place. But similar to that is take photographs. Take photographs of the site before the site's built. Take photographs of the site as soon as it's built. Make sure you have time and date stamps on your photographs. Keep it as part of your project file. There is nothing more effective in determining non-compliance or projects that have been modified without permit than pictures. It is critically important. Unfortunately, the engineers on the call today are going to cringe. I'm sorry, but as an attorney, we have as much concern as you do, which is that we're seeing clearly instances already where applicants have copied stamps from one set of plans to another so that they don't have to have an engineer actually review them and pay for that review. We've seen what is the apparent selling of stamps and signatures by PEs who are running mills, and just they have no clue what they're doing other than stamping plans and getting paid some hundreds of dollars to do it. This stuff's really important. And a question that came up during the chat is, well, what about structural? Yeah, what about structural? Especially when you have off-center loads, you don't have dead loads, you've got live loads, things like that. This is the stuff that is important because it falls right in the square center of police powers, which is to protect the public. So unfortunately, I have to tell you now that when we look at projects, and especially RF reports that are stamped by a PE, There are some PEs that we absolutely trust because they have consistently over the years done the right work. And there's some engineers that we absolutely know that if the project comes in from them, they have never actually, well, we actually well, not know, we actually believe that they've never actually reviewed the project, because if they had, there's no way they could have come up with the opinions that they did. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to do the Q&A. What you've been waiting for is going to come up in the last slide. I'm actually going to skip here's our contact information. I'll come back to this in a second. This slide will come back to it in a second so you can copy it down. But what I want to do now is make sure you know that this is the address, and Tony will come back to you in a second or a few minutes. This is the address where you can download the slides. Also at my website is where you can get the appropriate MCLE forms. Remember, this is still pending with the state bar. Christy and I would really, really appreciate if you would fill out, especially the evaluation forms, whether you're an attorney or not. This helps us understand where we were strong today, where we weren't. Give us that feedback so that it'll help us tailor future presentations. I know it's going to ask you to take a little time, but please do all that stuff. All the forms you need, all three of the forms actually are at my site here. We'll go back for a second for Q&A, and you can copy our contact information. But we've had a number of good questions coming in, and why don't we do this? If you'd like to ask a question, why don't you? I think you have a way of indicating that with it, putting your hand up, and perhaps Jack, if you could then announce people, do it that way. Should we do it that way, Jack?
Yes, that sounds good.
Hello, Jack. All right.
Yep, that sounds good.
Okay. So if you'd like to ask a question now, please raise your hand, then Jack will tell us who's going to ask the question.
And while we're waiting for that, really quick, Jonathan, there was a question about whether SB 378 applied to power. The legislative intent under that for that legislation was to facilitate wireless installations. I should mention, though, it does specifically reference fiber. Power can be fed over fiber technically, but I think that that would go outside the legislative intent.
Yeah, and just as a note on that, fiber over or power over fiber seems impossible since fiber is not conductive. But what it actually means in the industry terms is that along with the fiber cables, there's also a one or more pairs of copper cables that actually separately transmit the power with the fiber. And this is very common in small cells where you'll have a central power supply. Crown Castle does this in a lot of areas, where they'll have a central power supply, and then fiber and more importantly, power goes out from that central location to a variety of small cells in the area. And that way they don't have to have multiple meters and multiple power supplies and so forth. And from a jurisdiction's perspective, it's a good thing because it allows us to work with them to place the location of that central power supply in a less sensitive location and to reduce the footprint in front of, especially in front of homes. Jack, do we have a question? Because I've got the slides, I can't see it.
Yeah, we don't have any hands up right now.
Well, then I'd like to, there's some comments in the chat that I'd like to address. I know Jonathan addressed them quickly. Just something, it has to do with structural loads when you're adding a small wireless facility to existing infrastructure. Certainly, if you're going to add a SWIFT to an existing utility pole, there's going to be some concern. As you know, some of our electrical companies have gotten into a lot of trouble thanks to fires that have been caused as a result of overweighting the pole. So structural analysis on existing utility poles, especially your old wooden utility poles, is always taken very seriously. So I would encourage you to make sure that you're assessing the structural weight of the small wireless facility in light of the age and condition of the existing utility pole. With respect to streetlights, I don't usually see these getting installed on existing streetlights, in part because I request new streetlights. The existing streetlights typically don't have enough space within the pole to fit the conduit, and I don't like conduit on the outside. So we require that they remove the existing light standard and replace it with a new light standard so that the conduit can go down the middle. Those new light standards are obviously submitted to us with structural calculations showing it can withstand this, it can withstand the weight of the small wireless facility.
Christy, we had a question come in earlier, and I'll read the question. Because of the federal landscape applicable to small cell permit approval, are municipalities looking at the decision through the ministerial lens and not extending appeal rights for residents, third parties?
Yeah, and I believe I answered that a little bit earlier. I do see with small wireless facilities, these are all being handled administratively. There are, in some cases, there is appeal rights still. A director's decision may be appealed to the city manager, for example, but all of our small wireless facilities, almost all, I can't think of any of my cities that do it any other way than administratively.
So I will agree that that's certainly the best and most appropriate response or approach. But there's nothing in the law, and this is something the carriers bring up, is that you have to approve these ministerially. The issue is whether a site gets approved ministerially by the city manager, by a commission, whatever. The issue is not the process, but the result. So in some jurisdictions, until recently, one of ours, in fact, they were taking small cells to a commission for review, but the commission understood for that, and also for 6409, they basically didn't have much in the way of choice if the applications were fully consistent with the regulations. So if an applicant tells you that you have to follow a process, this is result oriented, not process oriented. We're coming up to the 2-hour mark, and we want to leave a couple minutes. We have 3 minutes left for our 2-hour window. I want to leave some room for Tony to come back in. But Jack, do we have any hands? I see one hand raised as I'm looking right now.
Yes, looks like Daniel Ramirez, please. You can go ahead and unmute your mic.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Jonathan and Christy as well for this presentation. It's very informative. The question I have is, have you dealt with any ADA specific issues, not in terms of ADA clearances when it comes to right of way, but ADA as in, let's say, Wi-Fi sickness?
Yes.
And okay. And if you can touch on that, please.
I'll give you the short answer. If anyone's looking for a long answer, they can contact us. My partner Trip May wrote a memo about this, but the order of events in terms of what laws were adopted and what laws preempted others. There's also a court case in the 10th Circuit on this, is that the current state of the law, although it's potentially changing because of current court case, the current state of the law is that ADA does not cover RF claims of RF impact on people. There is a well-known litigant in Santa Fe, New Mexico, who keeps on pushing this issue, but at this point, ADA does not cover wireless. We'll see if that changes. Any other questions? Why don't we bring in Tony to sign us out here? And again, thanks, Christy and I. Christy, I'll let you speak for yourself. This was an absolute joy to present and to see so many friends on the call today. Christy?
Yes, I have to echo that. It's been a long time, Jonathan, since you and I have spoken on the same panel, and it's always a joy. And it's exciting to see all of our members come and join us for this. And we appreciate you guys, being with us today, and really, really look forward to seeing everyone in person, fingers crossed, come the spring.
Absolutely. And with that, we'll bring back in the president of NATOA. Tony, go ahead and sign us off, please.
First off, thank you, Jonathan and Christy. You guys did a great job. Ton of information. Thanks for putting so much effort into this presentation. It was really good. And just briefly, just to remind people, go to the Scan NATOA website. The address is there on the screen, scannatoa.org. If you want to join us, you can join as a member. You can download and take a look at our calendar for upcoming events. And then also the video and the PowerPoint from today will be housed on the website. So it's 12, so just want to keep time and keep to the time, and want to thank everybody for participating. Have a great holiday, and I echo what Christy said. We hope that we're going to be able to meet people in person at some point in the not too distant future. So everybody have great holidays, and talk to you soon. Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Why don't Jack?